The cool October air of 2012 carried the scent of pine needles and campfire smoke through the dense forests of Mount Hood National Forest, Oregon. 14 fifth-graders from Cascade Elementary School had pitched their tents in a clearing surrounded by towering Douglas firs, their excited chatter echoing through the wilderness as they prepared for their first overnight camping trip. Tommy Mitchell sat cross-legged outside his tent, his worn astronomy book balanced on his knees, a small flashlight illuminating the star charts within. At 10 years old, Tommy was the kind of boy who collected rocks, knew the names of constellations, and spent his allowance on National Geographic magazines instead of candy. His thick-rimmed glasses caught the firelight as he traced the Big Dipper with his finger, explaining to anyone who would listen about the mythology behind Ursa Major. "There he goes again," whispered Jake Morrison, a stocky boy with freckles, who seemed to take particular pleasure in making Tommy's life difficult. "Spaceboy thinks he's going to find aliens out here." Tommy's cheeks flushed red, but he kept his eyes on his book. His teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had paired him with Jake and 2 other boys for tent sharing, hoping it would help Tommy make friends. Instead, it had given Jake a captive audience for his constant teasing. The campfire crackled as Mr. Peterson, their young teacher's aide, added another log. "All right, everyone, lights out in 30 minutes. Remember, no leaving your tents after 10 p.m. unless it's an emergency." As the evening wore on, Tommy lay in his sleeping bag listening to Jake's exaggerated snoring and the whispered conversations from nearby tents. The forest seemed alive around them, branches creaking in the wind, owls calling to each other across the darkness, and the distant sound of the Mackenzie River rushing over rocks. It was nearly midnight when Tommy saw them. At first he thought it was a helicopter, 3 bright lights moving silently through the trees about half a mile from their campsite. But as he pressed his face against the tent window, his heart began to race. The lights were too bright, too steady, and moving in a pattern unlike any aircraft he'd ever seen. They seemed to hover, then dart quickly between the trees, almost as if they were searching for something. Tommy's hands trembled as he reached for his glasses. The lights were definitely not natural, too organized, too purposeful. He grabbed his small telescope from his backpack, the one his grandfather had given him for his birthday, and carefully unzipped the tent flap. The October night was crisp against his pajama-clad skin as he crept outside, staying low to avoid waking the others. Through his telescope, he could see more clearly now. The lights weren't coming from above but seemed to be at ground level, moving between the trees in a coordinated pattern. Sometimes they would disappear completely, then reappear in a different location. His excitement building, Tommy forgot about the teasing, forgot about Jake's cruel words, forgot about everything except the incredible discovery unfolding before his eyes. This was it. This was what he'd always dreamed of finding. "Guys! Guys, wake up!" Tommy whispered urgently as he slipped back into the tent, shaking Jake's shoulder. "You have to see this. There are lights in the forest. I think it might be a UFO." Jake groaned and swatted Tommy's hand away. "What are you talking about, weirdo?" "I'm serious. Come look. There are 3 lights moving through the trees. They're not helicopters or planes. They're moving too strangely." The other boys began to stir, and soon all 4 tent occupants were peering out into the darkness. But the lights had vanished. "I don't see anything," Jake said with a yawn. "They were there. I swear they were there," Tommy insisted, his voice rising with desperation. "They were moving between the trees, like they were looking for something." "Sure they were, Spaceboy," Jake laughed, his voice carrying across the quiet campsite. "Tommy thinks he saw aliens." The snickering from nearby tents made Tommy's stomach drop. Within minutes, half the class was awake, and the story had spread like wildfire. Tommy tried to explain what he'd seen, describing the lights in detail, but each word only seemed to make things worse. "Maybe they were coming to take you home, Tommy," called out Sarah Chen from the girls' tent. "Yeah, back to Planet Weird," added another voice. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the teacher's tent, her hair mussed from sleep. "What's all this noise?" "About?" "Tommy says he saw a UFO. Jake announced dramatically. "He thinks aliens are in the forest." The teacher sighed, clearly exhausted. "Tommy, I'm sure you saw something. Maybe car headlights from the logging road, or equipment from the ranger station. But we need to get some sleep. Everyone back to your tents now." As the campsite settled back into quiet, Tommy lay in his sleeping bag, his cheeks burning with humiliation. The whispered jokes continued around him, and he could hear Jake mimicking alien sounds under his breath. The magic of what he'd witnessed was now tainted by their mockery, but Tommy knew what he'd seen was real. Unable to sleep and desperate to prove he wasn't lying, Tommy waited until he was sure everyone was asleep. The forest had fallen silent except for the natural sounds of night. Carefully, he slipped out of his sleeping bag, grabbed his telescope and flashlight, and crept out of the tent. The moon was nearly full, casting silver shadows through the towering trees. Tommy's breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he made his way toward where he'd seen the lights, determined to find some evidence, anything that would prove he wasn't the liar they all thought he was. The forest seemed different at night, more mysterious and somehow alive. Every shadow could hide a secret. Every sound could be significant. Tommy's heart pounded as he walked deeper into the woods, following what looked like a faint path between the trees. He never saw the men watching him from the darkness, and he never made it back to camp. Dawn broke over Mount Hood National Forest with a brilliant display of orange and pink, but the beauty of the sunrise was lost on the frantic group of teachers and rangers who had been searching since 4 a.m. Mrs. Henderson had discovered Tommy's empty sleeping bag during her routine check at 3:30, and within an hour, the peaceful campsite had transformed into a crisis zone. Detective Sarah Wu of the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office arrived as the morning mist was still rising from the forest floor. At 35, she was relatively new to missing persons cases, but her methodical approach and attention to detail had already earned her respect within the department. She surveyed the scene with practiced eyes, noting the layout of the tents, the proximity to the tree line, and the numerous footprints that had already contaminated any potential evidence. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said to Mrs. Henderson, who was wrapped in a blanket and clutching a cup of coffee with shaking hands. "Tommy was excited last night. He claimed he saw some kind of lights in the forest. The other children were teasing him about it, calling it a UFO. Mrs. Henderson's voice was barely above a whisper. "I should have taken him more seriously. I should have—" "You couldn't have known," Detective Wu said gently. "What time did you last see him?" "Lights out was at 10 p.m. I checked on all the tents around 10:30, and he was in his sleeping bag then. When I did my 3:30 check, he was gone." Detective Wu made notes as she spoke with each of the children. Jake Morrison, pale and subdued, was no longer the cocky boy who had tormented Tommy the night before. "He really believed he saw something," Jake admitted, his voice small. I made fun of him. We all did. He was really upset about it." "Did Tommy ever mention wanting to run away? Any problems at home or school?" Jake shook his head. "He wasn't that kind of kid. He was just different. He liked space stuff and science. He wouldn't have run away." By noon, over 40 search and rescue volunteers had arrived, along with tracking dogs and a helicopter. The search expanded in concentric circles from the campsite, covering miles of dense forest, rocky terrain, and rushing creeks. Detective Wu coordinated with the searchers while simultaneously running background checks on every adult who had known about the camping trip. Tommy's parents, David and Linda Mitchell, arrived from their home in Boring, Oregon, their faces etched with a terror that Detective Wu had seen too many times before. David Mitchell was the accountant at a local firm, quiet and methodical-like, his son. Linda worked part-time at the town library and volunteered at the elementary school. They were the kind of family that attended church on Sundays and never missed a school play. "Tommy wouldn't just wander off," Linda Mitchell insisted, her eyes red from crying. "He's cautious, responsible. If he left that tent, something made him leave." Detective Wu spent hours with the Mitchells, learning about Tommy's habits, his friends, his interests. She discovered that Tommy had no history of sleepwalking, no behavioral problems, and no conflicts with other students beyond the typical playground teasing. He was a good student, well-liked by his teachers, and deeply loved by his parents. As the search entered its second day, Detective Wu began to feel the familiar weight of a case that wasn't following normal patterns. Most missing children are found within the first 24 hours, either having wandered off and gotten lost or taken by someone they know, but Tommy seemed to have simply vanished. The tracking dogs had picked up his scent leading away from the campsite toward the northeast, but the trail went cold at a creek about half a mile from camp. The helicopter searches had covered hundreds of square miles, looking for any sign of a small boy in red pajamas. Volunteers had combed through dense undergrowth, called his name until their voices were hoarse, and checked every cave, hollow log, and potential hiding spot they could find. On the third day, Detective Wu interviewed the campsite supervisor, a grizzled ranger named Frank Torres who had worked these forests for over 20 years. "Kids don't just disappear out here," he said, shaking his head. "We've had runaways. Before, kids who got scared or homesick and tried to find their way home. But they always leave a trail. They always make noise. This boy, it's like he just evaporated." "What about the lights he claimed to see?" Detective Wu asked. "Could there have been any legitimate explanation?" Ranger Torres considered this carefully. "Could have been a lot of things. Maybe some night logging, though that's not supposed to happen in this area. Could have been campers with flashlights, or maybe some kids drinking in the woods. Hell, could have been poachers with spotlights, though that's illegal too." "Did you investigate any of those possibilities?" "We checked with all the logging companies. Nobody had crews working that night. No other camping permits issued for that area. And poachers? Well, they don't exactly advertise their presence. As the days turned into a week, then 2 weeks, the intensive search was scaled back. The volunteers returned to their regular lives, the media attention faded, and the forest returned to its natural quiet. But for Detective Wu, the case remained an open wound. She had investigated every registered sex offender within a 50-mile radius. She had interviewed every adult who had access to information about the camping trip. She had coordinated with FBI experts on child abduction cases. And still she had nothing. The theory that eventually gained acceptance among law enforcement was that Tommy had wandered into the forest, possibly chasing after the lights he claimed to see, and had suffered an accident. Perhaps he had fallen into one of the many creek beds and been swept away by the current. Perhaps he had fallen from a cliff or become trapped in an area too remote for searchers to find. The forest was vast and unforgiving, and a 10-year-old boy would have had little chance of survival in the October cold. But Detective Wu never fully accepted this explanation. Something about the case felt wrong, like a puzzle with missing pieces. Tommy was too cautious, too smart to just wander off aimlessly. And the lights he had described, while the other children and adults had dismissed them as fantasy, Detective Wu couldn't shake the feeling that they might have been real and important. The official search was called off after 6 weeks. The case remained open, but with no new leads and no evidence, it gradually moved to the back burner of the department's priorities. Detective Wu kept the file on her desk for months, reviewing it regularly, hoping for a breakthrough that never came. Tommy Mitchell had simply vanished into the Oregon wilderness, leaving behind only questions, heartbroken parents, and the lingering mystery of what he had truly seen that October night. Years passed. Detective Wu was promoted to sergeant, then lieutenant. She worked hundreds of other cases, solved dozens of missing persons investigations. But late at night when she couldn't sleep, she would sometimes find herself thinking about the 10-year-old boy with thick glasses and a love for astronomy who had disappeared without a trace, and she would wonder what really happened to Tommy Mitchell in those dark woods. By 2024, Detective Sarah Wu had become Lieutenant Wu, and the Tommy Mitchell case file had been relegated to a storage box in the cold case archives. The boy's disappearance remained one of only 3 unsolved missing persons cases in Clackamas County's history, a statistical anomaly that continued to gnaw at Wu's professional pride, even after all these years. The Mitchell family had never been the same. David Mitchell had quit his job as an accountant 2 years after Tommy's disappearance, unable to concentrate on numbers when his son's face haunted his every waking moment. He and Linda had divorced in 2018, their marriage another casualty of their unimaginable loss. David now worked as a night security guard, preferring the solitude and the darkness that reminded him of his endless searches through the forest. Linda had remarried and moved to Portland, but she still visited Tommy's empty bedroom in their old house every year on his birthday, leaving fresh flowers and a new astronomy book. The campsite where Tommy had vanished had been permanently closed to school groups. The official reason was budget cuts, but everyone knew the real reason. No parent wanted to send their child to the place where a little boy had disappeared without a trace. Jake Morrison, now 22 and a junior at Oregon State University, carried the weight of that night with him everywhere he went. He had changed his major 3 times, seeking something that might give meaning to his life, trying to balance the scales of guilt that had never stopped weighing on his conscience. He volunteered at a local youth center, worked with troubled kids, anything to try to make amends for the cruelty that might have driven Tommy into the darkness. It was a bright Tuesday morning in March 2024 when everything changed. Marcus Rivera, project manager for Cascade Development Corporation, stood at the edge of what had once been a remote and inaccessible section of forest about 15 miles northeast of where Tommy Mitchell had vanished. The company had purchased the 200-acre plot 6 months earlier, with plans to build a high-end residential community called Forest View Estates. The land had been cheap because of its isolation and the fact that the previous owner had let it fall into disrepair. "This old cabin's got to come down first," Marcus told his demolition crew, pointing to a dilapidated structure that looked like it hadn't been inhabited in decades. The building was more of a shack, really. One room with a corrugated metal roof that had rusted through in several places. Blackberry vines had grown up through the floorboards, and the windows were so dirty they were opaque. The demolition should have been routine, but when the crew began tearing down the interior walls, they found something that stopped them cold. Behind a false wall, in a space no larger than a closet, were the remnants of what appeared to be a makeshift prison cell. Scratch marks covered the wooden walls, desperate gouges made by small fingernails. A rusted chain was bolted to one wall with a cuff still attached, and carved into the wood, barely visible under layers of dirt and mold, were letters that made Marcus's blood run cold. Tommy M. Help. Within hours, the construction site was swarming with police, FBI agents, and crime scene investigators. Lieutenant Wu stood in the tiny hidden room, her heart pounding as she recognized the name that had haunted her for 12 years. The forensics team worked methodically, photographing every scratch mark, every piece of evidence, treating the scene with the reverence of an archaeological dig. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, the FBI's lead forensic anthropologist, examined the scratches in the wood with a magnifying glass. These were made by a child, she confirmed. The height of the marks, the spacing of the scratches, consistent with a 10-year-old. "How long ago?" Wu asked, though she already knew the answer. "Hard to say exactly without carbon dating, but the oxidation patterns suggest around 12 years, give or take." Wu felt a mix of vindication and heartbreak wash over her. After all these years, Tommy Mitchell had finally been found. Or at least, the evidence of his final days had been found. The property records revealed a complex web of shell companies and false names, but eventually led back to a man named Vincent Kowalski, who had owned the land from 2010 to 2015. Kowalski had died in a car accident in Nevada in 2018, taking whatever secrets he might have had to his grave. "This explains why we never found him," Wu said to her team as they pieced together the timeline. "This property was over 15 miles from the campsite, well outside our search perimeter. And look at the access road, it's barely a trail. In 2012, you would have needed a 4-wheel drive vehicle just to get back here." The discovery of the hidden room was just the beginning. With the location now known, Wu authorized a comprehensive search of the entire property. Ground penetrating. Radar was brought in, along with cadaver dogs and a full forensics team. It was Detective Mike Chen, Wu's former partner, who had recently been assigned to the cold case unit, who made the next crucial discovery. Following a barely visible trail that led from the cabin into the dense forest, he found what appeared to be the remains of an old escape route, broken branches at child height, fabric caught on thorns, and most tellingly, a small piece of red flannel that matched the description of Tommy's pajamas. The trail led to a natural shelter formed by fallen trees and overgrown with blackberry bushes, a place where a frightened child might have hidden. And there, carved into the smooth bark of a young maple tree in shaky, desperate letters, was confirmation of what they all feared. Tommy Mitchell, if found, call Mom and Dad. Below it, scratched in smaller letters, scared, cold, sorry. The forensics team found more evidence in the shelter: threads of fabric, a small button from a child's pajama top, and most heartbreakingly, scratch marks in the earth where Tommy had tried to dig for water or find edible roots. Dr. Hayes's preliminary assessment painted a tragic picture. Based on the evidence, it appears the child was held captive for several days, managed to escape, but was already weakened by his ordeal. He found this natural shelter and tried to survive, but she didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood. A 10-year-old boy, already traumatized and weakened by days in captivity, would have had little chance of survival in the Oregon wilderness, especially in October weather. The search for Tommy's remains continued for weeks, expanding outward, from the shelter in careful grids. The forest had changed significantly in 12 years. New growth had covered old trails, streams had shifted course, and the elements had erased most traces of human presence. But Tommy's story was finally beginning to emerge from the silence of the forest, and with it, answers to questions that had haunted a community for over a decade. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, a forensic accountant with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, had been tracing the complex ownership history of the property where Tommy's prison had been discovered. While reviewing bank records from 2012, she found a pattern of suspicious cash deposits made to an account linked to Vincent Kowalski in the weeks following Tommy's disappearance. "Look at this," Maria said, spreading the financial documents across Lieutenant Wu's desk. Kowalski's account shows regular monthly deposits of $2,000 for 3 years, starting in November 2012, just weeks after Tommy vanished. Then nothing. The payments stopped abruptly in 2015. Wu studied the records. Drug money? That's what I thought initially, but the amounts are too regular, too predictable. Drug transactions usually show more variation. This looks more like payment for services rendered or for silence. The investigation took on new urgency. Working with DEA databases and cross-referencing with local crime reports from 2012, Wu's team began to piece together a picture of organized criminal activity in the remote forests of Oregon. What they found was a sophisticated drug trafficking operation that had been using the isolated logging roads and abandoned cabins to move product from Canada to California. Detective Chen discovered the connection while reviewing arrest records from 2015. 3 men were arrested in a drug bust near the Washington border, he reported. One of them, Ramon Vega, was found with a map that included markings for several properties in our area, including the land where we found Tommy's prison. Vega was serving a 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary in California. When Wu and Chen flew down to interview him, they found a man whose swagger had been replaced by the hollow eyes of someone carrying a heavy burden. "I ain't talked to cops in 9 years, Vega said, his voice barely audible in the sterile interview room. "Ain't planning to start now." "We're not here about drugs, Ramon," Wu said quietly. "We're here about a 10-year-old boy named Tommy Mitchell." The change in Vega's expression was immediate and dramatic. His hands began to shake and he looked away from the detectives. "I heard you found him," Vega whispered. "We found where he was held. We found where he died. What we haven't found yet is justice for that little boy. And you're the only one left who can give us that." The story that emerged over the next 3 hours was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Vega, along with Kowalski and 2 other men, had been running a drug operation that used remote forest locations as temporary storage and transfer points. They would move product at night, using ATVs and modified vehicles to navigate the logging roads without detection. On the night of October 15, 2012, they had been transferring a large shipment from a Canadian supplier to distributors in California. The operation required careful timing and absolute secrecy. Any witnesses could have destroyed years of careful planning and millions of dollars in product. "We were moving the stuff from the storage cache to the vehicles," Vega explained, his voice breaking, "using these big floodlights so we could see what we were doing. Then Kowalski sees this kid, maybe 50 yards away, watching us through some kind of telescope." Tommy had stumbled upon the drug operation while trying to prove to his classmates that the lights he had seen were real. In his innocent curiosity, he had followed the lights deeper into the forest than he ever should have gone. The kid saw us, saw the drugs, saw our faces, saw the license plates. Kowalski said we couldn't let him go back to that camp and tell everyone what he'd seen, said it would bring the whole operation down. "So you took him?" Vega nodded, tears streaming down his face. Kowalski grabbed him before he could run. Kid was terrified, crying for his parents. We put him in that room at the old cabin. Told him we'd let him go once we moved the product out of the area. But you didn't let him go. Kowalski kept saying we needed more time, that the heat was too intense with all the search parties. Days kept passing, and the kid kept asking when he could go home. He was so scared, man. So young. Wu felt sick to her stomach, but she pressed on. "How did he escape?" "The lock on that chain was old, rusty. Kid must have worked at it for days. One morning we came to check on him, and he was gone. Kowalski went crazy, said we had to find him before he got back to civilization. They had searched for Tommy for 2 days, but the boy had hidden himself well in the natural shelter he had found. By the time they located his hiding spot, it was too late. He was already gone when we found him," Vega said, his voice barely a whisper. Kowalski said it was probably the cold or dehydration. Kid had been trying to eat berries and leaves, but Wu had to step out of the interview room to compose herself. When she returned, Vega continued his confession. "We buried him deep in the forest, far from where anyone would ever look. Kowalski made us swear we'd never talk about it. Said if any of us ever said anything, we'd all go down for murder." "Where is he buried, Ramon?" Vega gave them detailed directions to a location nearly 5 miles from the shelter, in a grove of old-growth cedars that would have been impossible to find without specific knowledge of the area. 3 days later, a team of forensic specialists carefully excavated the site. They found Tommy Mitchell's remains wrapped in a blue tarp, along with his red pajamas, his glasses, and the small telescope that had led him to his tragic fate. Dr. Hayes's examination confirmed what everyone had feared but hoped wasn't true. Tommy had survived for approximately 4 to 5 days after his escape, probably dying from a combination of exposure, dehydration, and exhaustion. The scratches on his hands and arms showed he had tried desperately to find food and water, and the wear patterns on his shoes indicated he had walked many miles trying to find his way back to safety. The news of the discovery and the arrest of Ramon Vega made national headlines. The story of the 10-year-old boy who had disappeared after claiming to see a UFO, only to have his remains found 12 years later, captured the public's imagination and outrage. Jake Morrison, now 22 and working as a youth counselor, attended every day of Vega's trial. He had spent 12 years carrying the guilt of his childhood cruelty, believing that his teasing had somehow contributed to Tommy's decision to leave the tent that night. "I made fun of him for believing in something he couldn't prove," Jake said in his victim impact statement. But Tommy was right. There were lights in the forest that night. He saw something real, something dangerous, and instead of listening to him, we laughed at him. Maybe if we had taken him seriously, maybe if I had been kinder to him, he never would have felt the need to prove himself by going into those woods alone. David and Linda Mitchell, reunited in their grief, finally had the closure they had sought for over a decade. Tommy's funeral was held on a sunny Saturday in May 2024, attended by hundreds of people from their small community. His former classmates, now adults, served as pallbearers. His teachers, his neighbors, and even strangers who had been touched by his story came to pay their respects to a little boy whose curiosity and courage had cost him everything. Lieutenant Wu, now planning her retirement after 30 years of service, kept a photo of Tommy on her desk. Not the official school photo that had appeared on missing person posters, but a candid shot his parents had provided, showing him looking through his telescope on a clear night, his face lit up with wonder at the mysteries of the universe. Ramon Vega was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for kidnapping and murder. In his final statement to the court, he said simply, "That little boy didn't deserve what happened to him. Nobody's child deserves that. I'm sorry it took me 12 years to tell the truth." The forest where Tommy Mitchell had spent his final days was eventually turned into a memorial park with a small observatory built near the spot where his remains were found. A plaque by the entrance reads, "In memory of Tommy Mitchell, whose curiosity about the stars led him into the darkness, but whose light continues to shine in the hearts of all who remember him." And on clear nights when the stars are bright over Oregon, visitors to the memorial sometimes report seeing lights moving through the trees, not the sinister lights of criminal activity, but the gentle glow of Tommy's spirit, finally at peace, still exploring the mysteries of the universe he loved so much.